It gives me anxiety. I don't want to see this shit. No, it gives me anxiety.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll play it
I'm
later.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Hey, my name is Sanjana Singh, and this is the Naked Dialogue podcast. Enjoy the ride. You're welcome. Hey, Abraham, what's up?
Hey, what is this? Where am I speaking? You haven't given me any context so far.
The context being we're on a podcast. It's called the Naked Dialogue, and you're the first guest.
So why did you choose me as your first guest?
Because you're a close friend, and I think that's a good enough person to have, and you have good ideas, and like you're an interesting person in general, so why not? Yeah.
Okay, what purpose do you see in this podcast?
I don't know, I've always loved having this, being able to have a platform where I can just speak and learn more and talk to people, even if it's formal, informal, it doesn't matter. You always learn something out of things. And I don't know, there's something about long form podcasts. I mean, even a conversation, leave podcasts alone. I feel like you can just talk and exchange and learn. Because every time you meet a new person, and if you do like long form podcasts with them, you get to know a lot of it. A lot of them, a lot of their ideas, and you get to also kind of like think about the ideas you have in relation to their ideas. I don't know, I feel like I really like the idea of, having long form conversations.
So what relevance does having a medium such as a cybernetic one like podcasting have to producing some sort of value by way of exchanging beliefs and opinions about reality? What is that phenomenon, and why is it so valuable? Why are we so lucky to be able to cherish it at a digitalized and democratized level?
I feel like it's a complex way to answer that, because podcasting has become it was more of a digital thing, but I feel like it's more cultural and digital thing now, because it's so embedded in culture, be it what we call broadly as pop culture. It's a part of entertainment, it's part of knowledge, it's part of everything.
But what is the essential phenomenon going on? I see it as a sort of philosophy of conversation. A conversation has a space, a topos to it, and is a realm of influxes of information. Why is that information valuable?
Because information is power. Well, the ultimate power is knowledge. And so what's the essence of doing this would be able to, first of all, gather new information out of people, then being able to communicate different topics, talk about different topics, and stuff like that with other people, and learn every single time. So that's the whole essence. I know it's quite broad.
No, but it clearly has a communal aspect of
sharing ideas.
Of creating a platform where people can bond over discourse and over having dialectics.
Yeah,
with themselves. But it also becomes a sort of marketplace for ideas, and it has an economy behind it, and I mean, this has, I think, the more essential implications being rooted to how society functions and what an intellectual circle can contribute to society. Because obviously we all benefit as learners, but what can the phenomenon of an intellectual circle of an academia, in the proper sense of the word, have on society? That would be where I'd be more interested in routing this conversation.
No, that's definitely interesting, because what we see in academia right now, at least from what I see on the video platforms, or just like probably the internet, is that the academia is trying to, I wouldn't say market, because market is such a commercial word, but it's the way to distribute ideas, especially like long form ideas, because like you can read papers online, you can read articles online, but what people are more interested in is having a person sit in front of you and explain it to you, give it to you straight. I mean, you can keep on reading the document and get to the end of it, but there's another level of understanding you would gain from virtually in this situation watching a person talk. And so that's how academia is trying to distribute their own ideas and knowledge and new theories, like geometric unity. Like even if Weinstein doesn't publish it, it's already out there. It's published in a virtual way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is a vast cornucopia of ideas that have been digitalized into different mediums. And there's clearly within academia, if that's what we're discussing in the university term, and also having a reservoir of wisdom, those ideas get transliterated into text and get memorized by these institutions through that medium. And through the cybernet, we do have access to them. And it goes the same for the virtual ghosts that still exist of people that have died long ago that were brilliant thinkers and that we had the privilege of recording with them. But having this cornucopia and this vast wealth quantitatively does not seem to have an effect on how much smarter society has become. And I think that's a worry. Why aren't people spending their whole days in libraries with the range of information that hasn't been discovered up to today? It's a tragedy, and it makes no sense if we consider ourselves intelligent humans, Homo sapiens, of knowledge.
Yeah, but it's
who
also
knows? The Homo sapiens is the animal who knows. Why don't we know all that we supposedly know at a sociological level through what thinkers have discovered? I think that it's a lack of investing into precisely the sorts of conversations that we're trying to have right now, which is a sort of intellectual discourse, a dialectic, an exchange of ideas in a forum which fosters some type of community feeling, with obviously the help from the cybernet. So I think one thing that I want to get out of this conversation is a better narrowing down of the conceptualization of whatever phenomenon is occurring right now and its societal ramifications.
I feel like it's the accessibility component or element or trait. In when we take virtuality in one side and reality in the other, I feel like what strains us away from reality is the accessibility of virtuality, because it's so accessible, everything's there. Why go to a library when I have a Kindle? It's that question.
Well, what I meant by the library was more of a metaphor. The same problem still exists when Homo sapiens encounter a hyper-saturated artifact of knowledge and still don't interact with it in order to extract all that it has. Even if you have a Kindle out of your hand's reach, you won't be reading it constantly, discovering all of the mysteries and wonders and measurements of every aspect of the world.
No, that's completely true. I mean, obviously you're not going to get the full reading and thinking experience out of virtuality itself, because it's virtual, it's not paper. I mean, that's for sure.
But my worry is at the point in which a human decides to incorporate this information with them. It's an ethical choice, really, to determine to love information, love knowledge, and seek for it and want to be satiated by it. And clearly the forms which we can intake are text, videos, podcasts on YouTube now, but books on in the library or printed pages, but we still don't read them. We still don't go to those libraries. We still don't click those links that we have saved in our tabs that could give us so much information. Why don't we take the step ahead to vigorously culture ourselves? And it obviously applies by degrees, but for someone who is attempting to be a literati or who considers himself to be one, even the intellectual could read that much more. So why isn't everyone doing this at some degree or another for basic education or an advanced specialized field specialized one? I think that's a strange mystery that we are in potency potentially omniscient, but that we decide not to profit of the bountiful resources of data and information and knowledge and wisdom that we have in representations and texts and in videos and stories.
No, that's true. I mean, where do you stand on superintelligence and AI, but not the general AGI, the artificial superintelligence?
So the artificial general intelligence has its limit in which we will still be able to perceive at which point of computation it's reached. And I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but I guess it's a good enough threshold to start with. If what superintelligence entails is a completely transhumanistic formation of what spirit could hold in a functioning entity at purely a phenomenological level, not even discussing whether it has a soul or is sentient or whether it even sees a difference between outside and inside reality. So we can just put it at an intermediate point of not necessarily having a mind, but still acting as if it had one. Well, that would imply that we would see the nearly unimaginable, or what is now the unheard of, the unseen. We would see the unseen. Whichever form it takes is anticlimactic and might not be as science fiction-y or as revolutionary as we expect, but the amount of quantity that it can produce will be, will not have any point of comparison in the universe, arguably. We can take a pause.
I fucking hate coffee. Wait. Good.
I'll restart from the thesis that I was just getting into, which was my real standing on superintelligence. And if I stand anywhere in relation to superintelligence, it's not in knowledge of how it will work, as I've tried to sort of outline here roughly. Superintelligence relative to an anthropocentrism or not will account for the maximum amount of complexity that the universe has potentially encountered. And, we have to think about it in the sense that humans, by creating technology, are nothing more than an extension of nature, and that we are still part of nature in creating ecosystems and ecologies by way of our technology, and it'll repeat under the same substrate of nature in itself throughout whatever technology creates epiphenomenally, projecting into the future the possibility of still having new knowledge, of novelty existing. The case of superintelligence assures us then that every aspect of the unknown can be revealed.
No, that's completely 100% true. But so would it be fair for me to say that you kind of share the same ideas about ASI, like Elon Musk. You're optimistic about it, and you don't want to be, and you try to avoid, like, you're careful with it, just like Elon Musk is usually when he starts to talk about AI, but you're also optimistic about it.
Ben Goertzel, who is the head of Hans Robotics, and he's consistent in the belief that if AI goes somewhere, it will successfully be able to integrate a compassionate morality, because that, at least from his axiological viewpoint, is the end goal of humans, to be compassionate, enlightened, and holistic with the world, in harmony with all. And so the event of his superintelligence going against human morality is incompatible with the type of intelligence that we're talking about, which it might be closer to wisdom, since the entity, which is this robot, has to both learn it and apply the knowledge that it learns.
I feel like there was someone whistling there, and I feel like definitely caught it.
ADHD.
And then there was a fucking horn. Did you hear that too?
No,
Like the ambulance thing?
I didn't hear that.
Okay. No, we can always keep on going. I can edit that out later.
You should put timestamps.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, that's a new feature on YouTube anyway. Right.
In letter 52 to Fleece, Freud commented on many of the elements of the psyche incipiently, without really knowing what structure he was forming to understand it. He was a pre-structuralist, of course, and so he would indicate many embryonic ideas, and one of them was the principle of inertia, which is known as the principle of psychical inertia. And this is elemental to his theory of libido and the libidinal economy that is essentially psychical force that runs through the body and is composed of instinct and spirit and mind. And the semiotic connection here is that the inertia is dependent on different signifiers which are connected in a chain, as Lacan would illustrate it, in the unconscious that dominate your conscious life. And what is more consciously unconscious than your body, that it moves around without it being dictated fully by your free will. When one wiggles their fingers when speaking, that is all related to whichever chain of signifiers are floating underneath you, and whichever psychical dynamos of thoughts, feelings, and concepts are centrifuging in your mind at certain instances, which, depending on whatever dynamo, on whatever symbol, whatever super image composed together, thrown together, as the etymology of symbol composes, which is symbole, which is to throw together. Whatever idea one is having at that moment in relation to the dynamo that I was speaking to earlier, that we might call whichever signifier gets prodded at. And depending on the signifier's relation to the subject's past, it will have a desire to not be fully seen or not be fully formulated at a symbolic or imaginary level, meaning that the mental representation will not be richer in detail but poor and foggy to see. And symbolically, the person will have difficulty describing it because it is the real. The body is the real, but it's also the unconscious in movement. And so, to tolerate the real, what the body does essentially is move upon these things. This is the principle of inertia, that neurological energy has to be discharged through the body. And the explanation for that is that of the signifier and how they relate to the subject and its phenomenological description, which is the idea, and how different ideas have different associations to people.
I mean, I like the part where you said that what's a human other than the unconscious and the conscious. Did I get that right? You said that.
No, what is more
human,
consciously unconscious than the body?
All right. You say that what was the real for you?
The real is that which escapes symbolization and which blurs paintings of your inner.
And where would you put it, in conscious and the unconscious?
It's both, but the unconscious and the real are almost synonymous.
What of it? Yeah, so I guess that was a very good insight on an informal psychoanalytic, setting that we have here in 21st century. But I don't know, tell me, why do you love philosophy, thinking? Why do you see yourself being attracted towards such a deeper level of thinking?
The why as to my obsession with knowledge or learning or understanding, I'm not sure of, but it's clear that it's been a guiding point of my life, that of wanting to learn and understand more, and usually that being connected to abstract ideas such as what is reality, or what is truth, or what is language, what are concepts, what is learning, what is understanding.
Yeah, so you're a truth searcher.
I think that these terms, such as philosophy or truth seeker or scientist or learner, or even sage, or all these sorts of societal roles that are connected to someone having knowledge and are up to question, just like the university, just like academia as such. Just because we've recognized them to hold some sort of knowledge, it doesn't mean that they really have it. So I don't know if my interest is philosophy per se. If anything, I take the ideas and the thinkers that have been categorized as philosophers, or that have at least contributed to philosophical thinking, as tools for my model of understanding existence and reality, which I take very seriously.
And also for creation.
Also as a tool, yes, for not only understanding, but to create an assemblage of ideas for me to use them as my creative substrate. I'm loving this. I'm I'm sorry that I can't be.
No, it's true. It's the first one. It's supposed to.
No, but I want it fucking crystal clean. Okay,
yeah, no, we can edit the fuck up.
crystal design. I want it smooth. I want it professional, flawless.
Yeah.
No edges uncut.
And we're back.
And we're back.
So yeah, you were saying that you have a pretty good understanding of history of philosophy. Why is that? From pretty young age, probably because you were studying it in high school, as I understand.
I didn't study the history of philosophy in high school, but I guess that peripherally made me need a temporal historical structure to understand the ideas that I was coming across. Because, well, the type of studies that I took were very essentialistic, and the theory of knowledge that was being communicated to me was more of an exposition of a philosophy of mind in some sense. It was a very rudimentary introduction to the possibility of knowing knowledge and how do we know knowledge. But there, in no sense, was there a projection to why we know knowledge, which I think is the pragmatist turn that many philosophers take if they are a good one. I think that is what designs an original philosopher, that there is a pragmatic output at the end in a very Jewish way. And the Semitic association that I make is because of the Tikkun motto that reformist Judaism has incorporated into their canon, and what it treats is a practical ethic of repairing the world and restoring the world. And so, an original philosopher does not only fix an issue, a pragmatic issue in society, after diagnosing it, or at minimum, after pointing out the symptom, offers an alternative. It doesn't mean that he completes the change he wanted to make. So Marx is correct in saying that a philosophy should change something, but it doesn't always happen. So I mean, the philosopher has to be good enough to offer plausible alternatives. That is the minimum requirement. Mm-hmm. We'll see if it'll commit a change or not in society and make him the best philosopher or the truest of philosophers, because mm-hmm. that is another criterion, that the philosophy of philosopher changes the world. The repairing or restoration of the world, that is the essence of the Tikkun motto, can be seen reflected in what a philosopher has to do and what many thinkers have done, which is to uphold the names of those great thinkers before them that they're standing on the shoulders of. And I think a reasonable balance of that and an original plane of coherence, as those would say, as well as a practical social reformist output. Those three components are what give a lot of credibility, rigorosity, and value to an original philosophy. Because there can be many original philosophies that are useless.
So what is an original philosophy to you?
I just gave the explanation.
So what is transcendence to you? Because transcendence could be, a lot of philosophers talk about transcendence in all different sorts of contexts, but still kind of related to each other. What is transcendence?
The meaning of a word. I think when people use transcendent, they usually mean some sort of out-of-body experience, or some sort of mystical,
esoteric maybe, yeah.
Encounter. The question of what is transcendence, philosophically speaking, is a degree of logic or an existing reality that can somehow explain whatever reality is, in some sense. The transcendence is compatible with our reality. If not, it wouldn't be transcendent and originative of what it has transcended. So transcendence needs to transcend something, and that thing that it transcends must be retroactively applicable to transcendence once it's transcended it. So that what that means is that transcendence and immanence are the same exact essence. So transcendence is not that big of a deal in my view. It's just a way of signifying the degree of relativism that an epistemology can have, meaning that a transcendental existentialism might take on the free will of Sartre well beyond the agency that he talked about, but to a omniscient godhood in the mind at large. That so I think that transcendence is, by definition, anything that transcends physical reality. And practically speaking, that is the imagination. And if we want to extrapolate it to where transcendence can exist, that depends on your state of consciousness, which is in epistemology as well as in ontology together. So technically, we are in transcendence already. And if you were to equate your state of mind with that, technically you'd be in a transcendent state. Who knows how many ranges of consciousness there are? So what matters is that there is immanence, at least in the dual ego level. So clearly there's a spectrum, and the dichotomization between immanence and transcendence is an illusion, because fundamentally it all exists within the same topos, which is the infinity of existence. So we can take on immanence, which is material reality, to another sort of conception, which would be to see it as imaginary. In other words, whatever our empirical epistemologies are composed out of might as well be so arbitrary to be composed out of something that is imaginary and that can be akin to transcendence itself. Transcendence is not exactly alterity, it's not exactly otherly. Transcendence is virtuality in potential. Philosophy game now of
I like how you said philosophy game.
Yeah, it's studying the sociology of ideas between thinkers, and it's a game to do it, and to see how our texts written, how our ideas exchanged from thinker to thinker over generations.
And so where do you stand on art? Because I know that you would define yourself like a bit of an artist too.
Yeah, I studied art in my high school education. In fact, I dropped my business course in order to enter art. Art as a concept of, or as art as the artist, the figure of the artist.
Yeah, it's like embodying the artist.
Well, the artist at a cultural level has connotations with the nightlife, which has become something very common nowadays among our generation. To go clubbing. What is the aspect of the social spheres at that degree? spending time vagabonding around cities at 4 a.m. in the morning, meeting new people, meeting strange people. That's all part of I think, a pretty conventional or basic level of interaction with other artists, which are presumably high in openness to new experiences. And so, it is no surprise if I hang out with people that fit the profile of an artist that I might consider myself one. So yeah.
So do you think like being a philosopher in 21st century and also having that kind of like an artistic character or whatever to your entire persona, do you think a philosopher in a very esoteric and mystical way is also an artist?
Yeah, I think that there is a high degree of similarity between the archetypes of the artist, the poet, the philosopher, the mystic. I think what they all have in common is
Creation?
at a subjective level. Yes, they are authors of their creativity and direct it for the purpose of creating objects of beauty and admiration by society. So the reason I mention the creation of an invention is because it has some sort of purpose, usually, in this sort of creativity. In all of the archetypes, the commonality is both the encountering of knowledge that transcends the layman's epistemology, whatever that may mean, and transcend into these worlds to recollect information and bring it back to the exoteric realm in represented ways.
So what would be the layman's epistemology?
It's well represented or manifest in academia nowadays. There are many laymen in academia, believe it or not. And those are the naive materialists. And naive is not meant in any pejorative way. It's the best way to describe their ontological belief, which is in a direct materialism. And that is what science, of course, ascribes to. And conventionally, culturally, science is at the top of the hierarchy of truth and has crowned itself as its queen.
Yeah, because it's the objective. It's more of the objective. It's the objective. Science looks for the objective, even though the observers are subjective. So that's where I see a flaw sometimes when people discuss quantum mechanics and like observers and stuff like that. I always find the whole observers thing subjective, because even if you're trying to quantify the phenomena or the experience or whatever you are trying to study, being an observer kind of inherently implies that you're a subjective person trying to look for objectives, but ultimately what you conclude is subjective.
The philosopher is also a scientist, but that's only if you discern from the common usage of science nowadays, which is culturally embedded in how it's represented in the university as this materialist functionalist way of looking at reality, instead of a deepening of all aspects of the mind and matter. A true science, unpolluted by the reductionism that we live in nowadays, which is clearly seen with neuroscience, thinking that can explain the quality and richness that a direct experience with reality that is consciousness can give us, is of course a flaw and an example of how we have failed to reach an appropriate discourse that says that science should also explore subjectivity. I don't think that's an issue that science does that. In fact, a purist scientist is a phenomenologist.
Okay, tell me more about what you think of consciousness.
So the place to start with would be an ontological standpoint. That is what we would be actually be discussing here. That is how consciousness can be equated in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And some may say that I'm making a metaphysical argument, but I would ascribe to epistemology being able to describe ontology perfectly. Consciousness exists, first of all,
Mm-hmm.
and that consciousness is all.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I say that we step into the waters of metaphysics is because I would also say that consciousness is oneness, and all is oneness, and consciousness is existence as well. And
so you're more of the Hermetic thought, the all, because you use the all.
I prefer just conceptualizing that type of thinking as metaphysical idealism.
Okay.
I think that's a good enough
Mm-hmm.
label. Because I don't necessarily extrapolate it to theosophical superstitions,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that a fundamental phenomenology, the mind at large, is the substance of reality, and that is what consciousness might as well be thought of.
Mm-hmm.
If we divorce the idea of mind and consciousness. And so if consciousness is what composes all,
Mm-hmm.
and all exists,
Mm-hmm.
then existence is a pluralist manifestation of the same thing. If all is consciousness and all is existence, then all is the same. So consciousness, apart from having this ontological status of existing and we being in it, and all entities forming part of it and being parts of that whole,
Mm-hmm.
has a isomorphic effect within us, which is that we are also that. We are consciousness as such.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be a sort of Spinozian view.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting you bring up Spinoza, because where do you stand on seeing everything as, because if everything is consciousness, then objects have consciousness too.
Not necessarily.
But imaging consciousness would be...
Having consciousness, I think, is still trapped within the anthropocentric view, or the conceiving of consciousness as human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So we're discussing consciousness here as an ontic phenomenon.
And what is the ontic phenomenon?
That it's well above any level of cognition, and so it envelops cognition, and cognition is integrated within it, and it completes those functions,
Mm-hmm.
but is irrelevant to whatever our cognition may be. That is the realist approach to a fundamentalist approach to consciousness.
Mm-hmm. When Sartre talks about perception and imagination and imaging consciousness, it's almost as if he tries to establish that the object has some kind of consciousness through the perception and through our imaging it as an object. So he tries to say, in a very indirect manner, almost as if the object has a consciousness or has a semi-consciousness.
So Seth is clearly a Cartesian,
Mm-hmm.
and his view that you placing intentionality onto an object may give that object intentionality is not incompatible with the belief that whatever that thing you're looking at is already consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter if that thing has consciousness, it already is consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
At the level of discussion that I introduced, what consciousness may be at the fundamental ontology that it is,
Mm-hmm.
it is irrespective of whatever a human phenomenological or empirical psychology may constitute.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that if Seth starts with the querying subject having doubts about reality and suddenly seeing an object and saying, oh, I have consciousness, and I sort of, through this intentional phenomenality, I revitalize this object. That's more poetic than anything. It's already in consciousness. It already has consciousness because it is consciousness. There's no distinction between you intervening in reality and giving that object consciousness, because that object was already in consciousness to start with. And so the subject and the object were already dissolved before Seth's questioning started. There was no point at which Seth had more of a consciousness than the object he was looking at. They are both consciousness. So this gives my argument a quasi-solipsistic, subjectivist, hyper-relativist edge, which is okay. That's the axiom from which I'm discussing consciousness from, because it's what makes the most sense to whatever consciousness as both a psychology and an ontology may constitute.
So an interesting idea came to my mind right now. What if there are levels of consciousness?
There are.
Yeah, no, but like, so you know how plants have consciousness because they're alive, right? So if plants, and now let's talk about psychedelic plants, because their consciousness has to be different, way different than the normal plant consciousness. And so, what level of consciousness do psychedelics possess?
Do psychedelic plants possess?
Yes.
Like a mushroom, for example.
Yeah, let's take mushrooms. Yeah.
That is we could use Rupert Sheldrake's conception of the morphogenetic field, in which it's argumented that biological systems are interweaved with whatever occurs in time and space surrounding them. And so Terence McKenna would say that since so many people have taken mushrooms, that all of the psychedelic journeys that every individual had gone through were stored into the species of any psilocybin mushroom that existed. And so taking the mushroom gives you this enormous archive of Ashkakic records that have been stashed by each individual that has reported on their trip. So in some sense, a psychedelic might have a memory if we are at that level of relativism and we decide to believe that theosophy.
What if plants have their consciousness, taking it as a broad term, have a collective unconscious too?
Right, that's the argument that's being made.
Yeah.
Which as I say, I'm open to, but any metaphysical argument is deemed to be questioned. So I'm ambivalent to it.
Yeah, because when your consciousness and the plant's consciousness, that is when you're taking mushrooms and you experience this heightened level of consciousness where, elements from your unconscious psyche is coming out is projecting on the imagery that the psychedelic is showing you. And so, how if plants have consciousness, and if those plants also have psychoactive compounds in it, when we are kind of tripping on mushrooms or any classical psychedelic, the level of consciousness we reach being different from the level of consciousness we have in a sober state, how much does that affect the way we experience life? Because like when you know that you have a normal perception of the world where everything's fixed, there's the real, and then there's the imagination that you put yourself into, that your mind works at, and then boom, you're experiencing the same reality but distorted, but also with the elements of your unconscious archetypes.
I think that it's not necessarily a distorted version of reality that you're seeing.
Yeah, I would say distorted visual imageries, more or less. Yes.
It's a distorted consciousness. It's not only the visual precept.
Mm-hmm.
It composes your whole body, your whole mode of cognition. I think the distinction that you're indicating towards is, if we have on one side the 12 Kantian categories that are the ones we usually have floating around in our heads while we walk around and observe reality, and then we have on the other side a psychedelicized bonobo observing the jungle,
Mm-hmm.
stoned.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, those categories might be refracted, dissolved, transmuted, sublimated, transduced into plenty of other new reconfigurations of these same categories.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, there are degrees of consciousness, and
Mm-hmm.
we're really accustomed as humans to
Mm-hmm.
this dual ego world, subject, object, personality, others, reality, or compositions of worlds of our inner and outside world. We're used to this level of functioning. But of course, even within that, there are infinite degrees of flavors that distinguish different actions and phenomena
Mm-hmm.
that occur in our lives. And so the delimitation of consciousness is conditioned heavily by our pre-existing bias of being an ego in reality. So whatever is outside the ego, and whatever is outside the usual threshold that separates the unconscious, what is known as the bar that limits which signifiers can float up to the top, because of what they are as the real, I think is limitless. That is it's the realm of the imaginary put together with the real.
We have all these different continents, and in every continent we have these different tribes of shamans, and they have their own mescaline, DMT, ayahuasca. What if we tried to study the collective unconscious archetypes of the plants, psychoactive plants? What if we can get an understanding of, how the entire collective unconscious as a whole, rather than it being specific to a culture, to a region, but the planet as a whole.
That exists, but because there's a pluralism of collective unconsciousnesses.
Mhm.
The Weltgeist in German, the spirit of the world, is one. There's any degree of entity that can exist. Is any degree of entity that is imaginable can exist. That is the condition of the imaginary,
Mhm.
and that is what a transcendence in consciousness entails. That anything that is stored, or that is a resource in the imaginary, can be represented.
Mhm.
That's the functional side of knowing and being. Once you are high on entheogenes,
Mhm.
once you are that, you will know whatever depths of your psyche were carved out by the new tool that you've encountered in plant.
Mhm. So what's even more interesting is that when you have all these unconscious, collective unconscious archetypes from the plant, psychoactive plants, and when you try to identify the archetypes, it's usually geometry, it's usually natural stuff. So, five elements of nature: fire, water, all that stuff. So, that kind of gives us an understanding of how collective unconscious archetypes work in a global way rather than in a regional or continental way, but also at the same time having some kind of cultural root. So,
No,
that's why
that
people.
has a materialist
Mhm.
edge to it, which is relevant.
Mhm.
Which is that, yes, our mind, being an organic entity, has a a genealogy with geography and geology, intrinsically. but that is at a knowledge level. It's within the content of the collective unconscious instead of the framework, the
Mm-hmm.
metaphysical framework that composes that transcendent mind that
Mm-hmm.
is a collection of minds. So, of course, the collective unconscious is essentially the Ashtagic records themselves. There's no differentiation, but pragmatically speaking, we can also phenomenologically ascribe temporal unconsciousnesses, like the one we're having right now.
Mm-hmm.
Just by two subjects interacting, we've created a unpersonal unconscious between us.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many configurations, both immanent and transcendental, of the collective unconscious in the form of many types of collective unconsciousnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And the fundamental one being the mind at large,
True.
which are so that puts us in the position of, can the ego dual mind gain access to whatever ontic omniscience this mind at large may have, that is in us, that we are in of, and that we definitely have proof all over the world that there has been access to transcendent ideas with
Mm-hmm.
mystical experiences, psychopathology, shamanism, psychedelics. Um, the point to reconcile, I think, is not a philosophical one in regards to what exists, what doesn't exist, what can we extrapolate from our psychology that might give us some grounding to understand an abstracted transcendent object such as the collective unconscious, but rather what the hell is located in the collective unconscious? What territory have we not explored with unknown treasures and artifacts and medicinal plants to bring back to our culture, which is this dimensional world, and make it better? I think there's a utilitarian or at least pragmatic end to all of this, and we have to send those shamans into those territories for them to bring back the information.
Mm-hmm.
And that is precisely the role of the artist, the role
True.
of the philosopher,
Mm-hmm.
the poet, the mystic.
Mm-hmm. When you're in a transcendental state and you encounter your external stimuli, which is the environment, it's either nature or geometry. What I see in studies or psychedelic culture is that people would mostly concentrate on the image distortion, which is a hallucination, but they would never question as to why they would see a certain pattern of geometrical cubes or geometrical.
A purely aesthetic object.
Yeah.
Yeah, with no other meaning behind, or at least seemingly
Mm-hmm.
in appearance, with no other meaning but the object itself. So I think the type of discussion that we're having here is one where we still believe that the symbolist approach to aesthetics as having an internal language that is not linguistic is at play here. So the symbolists are aesthetes because their poetic constitutes a uh, a use of things such as color or geometric organization as having a pure meaning, which we might call a translinguistic semiotic.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question here is a matter of aesthetics, and that aesthetics contain information, and that it might as well be understood as language because it is read, um, but not at first hand. It's directly intuited too. Um, that especially when it's used in rhetorical forms, in painting, or even in modern poetry, where text is rotated and aligned in obstructed ways separate from the text. I think that having the axiom of the symbolist, which is that pure aesthetic objects have and contain a, a fundamentally linguistic energy, is a good path of investigation. But the matter of that you're tackling of geometric lattices and impossible geometries within the mind's eye, which hypnagogia or psychedelic trips can give you, is particularly complicated.
Yeah, so the context being a few nights ago, I had a hypnagogic experience wherein, I mean, usually in most of my experiences, I would see geometry, I would see Tetris effects, I would see animals, insects, and the background would usually be red, except for the times I would have Tetris effects. Because, so basically, what Tetris effects are is that it takes instances from your working memory and it would implant it into your hypnagogic experience. That is, when you're entering your REM stage of sleep, the very first phase. And so Tetris effects would show you, okay, maybe I was doing something at 4 a.m. in the morning, so I would see myself doing it again. And it would take me 2 minutes to see Tetris effects. It wouldn't intrigue me as much as when I would see geometrical insects, specifically insects and spiders crawling out of corners, and within a red background. Would I don't know if it might scare people, but for me it's very interesting because why am I seeing animals? Why am I seeing spiders? But coming back to the geometrical part, I would usually see a Star of David, um, you know, ascending in size. So it's as if it starts and it keeps on ascending, and you would have like a lot of Star of Davids just next to each other and extending in size. And so I've been thinking about it, reading about, all sorts of geometrical patterns and everything. And every single time I would, try to, what if geometry is the objective archetype? That's one question that comes to my mind, because geometry showing up in the most conscious and unconscious experiences does definitely have something to do with the way we perceive or we live in this reality.
The question is to what degree?
Yes.
Geometry might as well be the underlying interstices of the universe, as I think Eric Weinstein might agree with from his observer's theory and geometric unity. That I think that geometry could explain the framework of reality at a
quite a
physical level.
Mhm.
But so when we look at these levels of consciousness and the levels of information that we can accrue through our images, the question is to what purpose do we want to put the wisdom that we learn from our inner landscape, from our inner images that are compasses that direct us somewhere? Well, where do you want to be directed? What truth are you actually looking for? The truth of knowing exactly what numbers the matrix code is composed out of, or the manual of living, of being a human being. I think that I'm much more interested by perhaps how an image can give us a download of information that has nothing to do with the structure of theoretical physics, and instead gives us some sort of instruction in how to live our lives better, and how to have existential axiology, how to live the good life, how to build a better ethic, a better character, to know more about oneself. I think that is the fundamental goal, and learning about the universe is a perfectly valid avenue of learning of oneself, because you are learning of something that you're a part of. But how intimate are you to an equation of quantum mechanics, existentially to a high degree, but poetically, existentially, or axiologically, existentially, not so much. And there's not that much relevance in your life world as to whether it is geometry or algebra that explains the theory of everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's my point of view, which is why I find your avenue that you take very interesting, because it would be a Jungian James Hillman psychology of images, or
Mm-hmm.
imaginal psychology, that assesses images and has a therapeutic approach to the patient. Um, but I'm missing still the pragmatic value of contemplating whether the recurrence of hallucinatory geometries have some degree of effect in our daily lives. That knowledge. It's a question of criticizing and valuing and taxonomizing and discriminating knowledge.
No, I mean
And
that's true. I feel like I take geometrical truth as the truth of the universe, which might be a bit narrow thinking, but I feel like, yeah, we do have the exoteric and the exoteric. But when we take science and I mean, particularly when I see geometry on hypnagogic, experiences, and then psychedelic experiences, and sometimes even, you know, disassociative experiences. It's weird seeing um, geometry and then knowing that geometry is such a primitive like concept, because we created it, we follow it, we teach it,
but we're in it as well. It's
but we live it.
yeah.
That's the point. We live it.
Dimensions compose our visual processes.
Exactly. And so, when I see geometry in any of these experiences, it just I keep on thinking, if it is the objective, then maybe we should be investigating that more than theorizing things. Like, you know what I mean? Because yes, we need theory, but we also need practice in order to prove the hypotheses we make. And so I would usually call, these geometrical hallucinations as being part of the otherly, giving it like an esoteric touchdown or whatever, kind of labeling it there. But it's so contradictory because it's geometry and I'm trying to mystify it or, esoterize it or whatever. But that's the thing about, researches with dreams, researches with psychedelics. You have bizarre conditions to analyze, bizarre hypothesis to prove, because it's like an assimilation of all these different kinds of affective and other sorts of responses, because there's so much to be considered, but it is so fundamental yet, like.
I think that what you're describing is the fundamental aspect of the symbolic realm which we inhabit as subjects.
Yeah.
So the question of whether these geometric patterns are otherly or not is, I think, a bit irrelevant, because obviously they are otherly, they are alterity, they are extimate, they
Hmm.
are familiarly unfamiliar. Why?
Hmm.
Because they are part of the symbolic order. They are a semiotic structure. They are translinguistic, yet fundamentally semantic.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Not to say that it has a palpable semantics like language does, but it is an informational structure.
Hmm.
So the to put it as otherly or alien to you is not necessarily extricating it from the subject as a whole. The subject can incorporate otherly. That's the whole point of the other, that the other is you and you are the other.
Hmm.
Not only at a fundamental metaphysical idealist level, as I was purporting earlier, but at a very practical psychological level of you incorporating the others and that being a functional and essential part of your psychical functioning, that the other exists and has existed and has satisfied your needs. The otherly is also the mother. It's also physical matter. It's what is outside of you. The outside is the external as well, in some sense, because it is you. And the reason that it is you is because there's no distinction between you and your consciousness. You're not your body, nor are you your mind or your personality. You are the dynamic functioning of this body-mind organic interface. There's no distinction between nature and you. There's no distinction between the universe and you. There's no distinction between abiotic and biotic. The you, we have the privilege as humans of recognizing that we have a you, but we limit our epistemological webs to not encapsulate what the you fundamentally is. That is what is known as the bigger self. I think that is Dasein in its most manifested way. And ontologically, you are everything, fundamentally. Epistemologically as well. That is the precondition for ontology, all of ontology being you, is that you recognize that you are also the producer of all of your ontology at a fundamental level. Disregarding consciousness or unconsciousness, we're out of that realm of conversation. But symbolically, regardless if it's conscious or unconscious, any information process is you. And so if that part of reality, which is semiotic, which is material reality, exists, we're not saying whether material reality is real or not. It's still part of the subject. You are creating it. That is why this subjectivist position feels no allergy to something otherly being so alien from itself that it cannot reconcile as one. We are back to oneness. The subject is in fact split functionally, but organically it is this becoming assemblage of many things at once, and it is unified in the eternality of the present in time, in a sense, at least phenomenologically speaking, which is the relevance here. We are transcending consciousness. We are understanding all sides of the semiotic. That is the goal. We are appropriately throwing the net of the symbolic onto the real and capturing all that we have to capture. We're hopefully doing all of that, but fundamentally, it's the life world that we were speaking of. The transcendence doesn't matter anymore. Where we can get the knowledge does not matter anymore. The important part is that we do, that we are existential beings and we have a life, and that there are plenty of avenues to access all of these knowledges. But you create your own value and you create your own tools. I think part of the discussion also that we're having is how much should we depend on the tools that others have created. But I think starting with the symbolist belief of aesthetics being able to have their self-sufficient value, it runs parallel to the existentialist paradigm of creating your own, which is fundamentally done through a recognition of the subject as this transcendent immanent becoming of a body and mind which is unified. So ontology is irrelevant, epistemology is obvious, and action is what we have to do, believing that we are free.
What do you think about healing with creation? Because this morning I was reading this article about
at a therapeutic psychological level, or
at a psychological
at a
level.
physiological level.
You heal through creation.
So there are many angles, obviously, to where can we get medicine from, and the medicine man has been commonly known as the shaman. And I think nowadays, if we're seeing any guide of the tribe that has some sort of wisdom, it's in our therapists. So I think that goes hand in hand with the talking cure of anadot, that is known as one of the pillars, or at least the slogans of psychoanalysis originally, that just by speaking, you feel better of whatever hysteric symptoms you could be presenting, whatever psychosomatic symptoms you came with to the clinic. So the power of healing, if you're reducing it to the psychotherapeutical medium, I think that it's obvious that words are magical. And Freud would say that what are words? What are the words that we use in our day-to-day basis but watered down magic? Is because we forget that language has tremendous implications in the way we create our own reality. And I think a unifying aspect between the avenue of creation as such and using language in speech and in other avenues between other people introsubjectively. We can also think about it introsubjectively and how can we heal ourselves psychologically through creation, and that would be the paradigm of the artist. And the unifying aspect that I was talking about earlier would be the poet, that unifies language as such and twists it to its wit in order to supposedly communicate something. So there's still a dependency on the otherly, because the symbolic is the otherly, language is the otherly.
True.
And language exists because the other exists. And so a poem exists because there is some other that needs to have some sort of reaction to whatever has been written. And in the case of the artist, to whatever has been seen in the painting. There's always a demand of the other by way of any semiotic projection and materialization into reality by the creator artist or the creator poet, or even the creator existentialist that is successfully fulfilling its potential in life and is breathing in bliss, walking throughout his life role. I go back to that, and perhaps it has too much of an optimistic edge, but an existentialism is compatible with a species of Spinozian acquiescence, in which in loving God you can have bliss and ecstatic divinity as you walk through the streets and wake up in the morning and do your prosaic and quotidian lifestyle. But the only way to do that is by way of changing your epistemology, and I think that structurally it goes the same with changing your language. Changing one's epistemology is how do you change the way you juggle with your concepts? How do you name things correctly at this point, appropriately tailored to whatever your experience is? There's no difference there. So there is also a macro element to creation at an existential level of your own life by way through words in the way that you reach at conceiving your own life. I think that's an avenue for literally knowing yourself. Knowing yourself is not knowing your preferences or your favoritisms or
all the superlative questions. Yeah.
Right. It's learning what your life is, what encompasses your life. What do you give value to at a fundamental level? What your beliefs are, what your actions are, how you use your words.
I see a major flaw in the psychoanalytic world today. I feel like the psychiatric model has obviously failed. It's always been a failed model.
But you're equating the psychoanalytic model to the psychiatric one.
No, I'm saying that psychoanalytic could still be saved, but psychiatric is gone. Or it could be saved. We still have hopes. And the reason why I say that is that, the heavy use of, the whole psychology and psychotherapy, clinical psychotherapy, CBT, everything is so popularized now, and we have so many Lacanian schools, so many Jungian schools, so many integrated, psychodynamic schools of treating uh, all sorts of neuroses through talking. And I always doubt the psychologist or conducting that analytic meeting, because it's so popularized. We have a lot of people in this field now. It's a job. It's a job at the most. We have thousands of people getting into university to study psychology. Why? Because I want to be a therapist. And do you really want to be a therapist, or you're there to make the money? Because like that's what I see the most here. Like whenever I would walk into a psychological department under a hospital, I would see all these just psychologists, clinical practitioners, whatever. And the way, you're always taught you're supposed to create free association, you're not supposed to push the analyst in too far. They always do it because they have a time frame. And obviously everything's going to have a time. There has to be a certain time limit set to the analytic meeting, because when does it end, right? But they rush it so much, they don't take their job seriously, and everything has this, kind of Freudian connection. So you're, going through this, it might be because of this Freudian concept. So kind of like choosing the very broad, like, not, you're supposed to, I feel like psychologists are supposed to be as integrative as possible rather than choosing one single method. So I feel like, that's quite naive there. And when you use a certain one model and you try to meet a patient, you don't even know, you haven't even diagnosed the person yet, and you're thinking of, okay, he seems to have depression. It could be, whatever, this complex, that complex, and so this is the result. That's what Freud did to a couple of his patients. Is that they would come to him, mostly war soldiers, and be like, oh, it is PTSD, but he would treat them as like a goal he's trying to achieve, as like a thing he's trying to mark off his notebook. Okay, next subject.
What are you diagnosing from psychotherapeutics nowadays?
I don't see pure psychoanalysis in play. I see a very fake, not even fake, but very commercial, very, you know, maybe it's because it has a similarity with culture, but I don't see pure psychoanalysis nowadays. All I see are therapists sitting, having five different, okay, this patient could be this, having generalizations, not truly trying to understand the essence of the person, but picking one scenario and connecting, associating it with the patient's neurosis, and boom, you have a diagnosis. There you go. And that's why the psychiatric model is failed, because they would, all you need to do is walk into a psychiatrist's place, tell her, oh, I'm suffering through this. She's a psychiatrist. She's going to give you medicines, because that's how psychiatry works. They use medicine to treat you, or they use, certain techniques or whatever. But it's a shortcut to relieving yourself. But you know how shortcuts are. They're like drugs.
But
You
mediocrity
need
is
more.
everywhere, bureaucratically speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I still feel like, the whole psychiatric model stands on treating the DSM, disorders with these specific pharmacological medications, but not integrating it with a useful therapy. Because, like, when you imagine giving a patient, a bipolar patient, let's say, their medications that they need to either cope up with mania or depression, whenever it occurs, be it like, any kind of personality disorder. It doesn't have to be bipolar necessarily. It could be borderline personality disorder. You just give them the medicines and you tell them to take it every day at a particular amount of time. Yeah, exercise, drink green tea, but and he or she or they or them whatever, they keep coming back to you and you will still keep prescribing. And so when does it end? So you know what I'm saying, that yes, bipolar is a condition, it cannot be cured, whatever, but you have to come to a certain level of contentment with the subject in order for the subject to feel like, yes, I can either live with it or overcome it, because you can overcome it, you just need to get it under control. But the psychiatric model would just,
what is the line in between the patient being a money a cash cow and the psychotherapist doing something of true value?
yeah, I mean, yes, definitely psychotherapy is the way to go, but psychotherapy could only be psychotherapy if it's done in a very correct way. Like, we were reading Ogden in a class before, and so how he talked about taking patients only because he would call up the patient. So let's suppose a patient called him up and he's like, I have this problem, I need to meet you. So he would do like this consultation call first before the analytic meeting in order to get to understand him a bit. So if he can figure this guy out or not. Because if he cannot, he's wasting his time and he's wasting the subject's time and money and everything.
Yeah, there are many nuances that are unapplied to modern day psychotherapy. Because it's not taken as seriously because it's not something new or needing too much innovation. There are, I don't think it's a coincidence that extreme improvements in hyper specialized fields of psychology are intersecting with this sort of conformism to not treat therapies that have a lot of potential, such as psychoanalysis, with more care. Um, I think that psychotherapy and psychology, in a practical sense nowadays, is akin to the mystical schools of the past, and the way that the master disciple relationship worked in these places. The advantage nowadays is that many of us can participate in a pseudo priesthoodness,